Okay, I think we are about to commence. I'm Marvin Ott, Asia Fellow, formerly federal government. I'm not a specialist on Japan in any real sense at all, but I do try to focus on Southeast Asia, and Japan is a very important part of the Southeast Asian landscape, and particularly in the economic sector and increasingly the security sector. As I was commenting to one of our speakers, the previous panel was really terrific, and I hope if you were either a participant on it or part of the audience, you had a chance to get some real benefit from it. It's too bad we have basically a very sparse turnout, and of course what I'm reminded is we're running up against a very strong headwind in the form of the World Bank IMF meetings, and then all the spin-off think tank conversations and discussions and so on going on in relation to those meetings. So our timing was bad in that sense, and I'm sorry for that, because as I said, the previous panel was really, excellent, with emphasis. Okay, we're hoping to maintain similar standards, and we expect to maintain a similar standard now. Maybe I'll just very briefly, you have the bios of the participants, and many of you are familiar with them personally, so I'll simply note that our panel consists of Nobu Aizawa, Wilson Center, Kyushu University, visiting professor in Thailand at Cornell, a distinguished addition to the Wilson Asia program here. I'm sort of random order here. Courtney Weatherby, Stimson Center, author, analyst, contributor to a number of Stimson publications, including on the Mekong, an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, and Stimson has been absolutely critical in leading professional and public attention towards that issue. Larry Greenwood, currently Bauer Group Asia, but a very distinguished career. I won't even start to enumerate in both the corporate and very widely in the government sector. So brings about as rich a resume from both government and private sector and think tank as you could possibly bring to a subject like this. Brian O'Byrne, USAID, senior figure in the Asia Economic USAID, attention to this part of the world. You have the details of his background. So with that, let me, I think I'll basically just go in the order that people have arrayed themselves to my left and ask Nobu to begin with a few remarks.
Okay, thank you, Marvin. So the theme is, I think it was Japan's leadership and its relationship, Southeast Asia, U.S. Japan.
Southeast Asia, corporate, Japan.
That's right, yeah. It's a big topic, so I can go on, but I will limit myself here. I think I would like to highlight maybe 2 points as my initial remark. When we talk about Japan's position in Asia, I think the Japanese corporate really is the big player, maybe more so than the government. I will put that especially in the Southeast Asian context. I'll give you one very exact example which happened in 2014 Thailand. That was the time 2014 Thailand had a coup. And of course, the United States was critical about the coup, and the Japanese government also echoed that note. But it was resisted by the Japanese corporate group. We shouldn't be aligned with the United States. We have different interests in Thailand. which is fair to say. We have so much of corporates in Thailand. We have like Japanese residents in Thailand. We can't put the Japanese residents in Thailand at risk in creating a political stance onto a domestic political changes in Thailand. And that really reshaped the Japanese government's position vis-a-vis how they deal with Thailand, especially in vis-a-vis when Japanese government wanted to have a very strong ties with United States. So that already kind of tells how much the Japanese corporate existence in Southeast Asia really is the shaping force of Japanese foreign policy towards Southeast Asia as well. So, I mean, having said that, we could also recall that Japanese-Asian relationship is now very much gearing towards Southeast Asia too. If you look at the investment numbers, it's already 4 years that Southeast Asia gained much more investment than China does. Not even 4 years, maybe also 8 or 9 years already. So there's already a kind of consensus where the priorities are when you kind of ask the Japanese corporates about Asia. There was a very interesting Nikkei survey, like what exactly are you concerned in Asian political economy? Number one topic was not about South Korea, not about China, but it was really about Thailand. Thailand political climate was really the topic that Japanese corporate really was concerned. And if you look at the Nikkei newspapers, you will notice how much coverage you have. So if you focus on the Japanese corporate view on Southeast Asia, I think that is very, very clearly shown. That's one aspect. The second aspect is also about how Japan to thrive in the coming decades. As the previous panel already, kind of acknowledged how Japanese corporates has lagged behind in the dot-com economy. But the interesting happening is that there are many young Japanese startups blooming in Southeast Asia rather than in Japan. That is a new trend of innovation of Japan. I mean, if you put from a government point of view, it might not be the rosy picture because it could be characterized as a brain drain. But if you look at in the business sense, Southeast Asia is becoming an incubator for a new Japanese innovation, so to speak. You could give you an example. I could give you an example like Omisego. I don't know if you've heard about Omisego in Thailand. That's a Bitcoin-based P2P banking. It initially wanted to start in Japan, but because of the regulations, it couldn't. So they fined for the second places. He had a very nice Thai buddy that he could rely on, and so he, set up. And because of the clusters, the accumulated numbers of companies in Thailand, you could actually tap into that network to start up a new business model that is very friendly to a Japanese business model. So this is happening in Thailand. Another case, like there is a new startup that brings small and medium farmers to a top-notch restaurants. It wanted to do in Japan, but because the Japanese farmer didn't have smartphones, it couldn't use the benefit of the system, but it flourished in Manila. So that, so in a nutshell, Southeast Asia is accumulated kind of economic environment has now not only cemented its political weight, but it also become an incubator for innovation for future Asia. So to wrap those two elements up, I think Southeast Asia and Japanese economy are very much now integrated. And I think that integration has become a very strong ballast for a kind of a relationship in the midst of US-China tension. I think many Southeast Asian countries, in the previous session was highlighted how much the Southeast Asian leader trusts the Japanese. It's really because of those kind of ballast functions that they're playing. Of course, there are challenging. The ballast is very intangible in itself. It doesn't really showcase the Japanese brand itself. So I can talk about that on and on, but let me stop there.
I can't resist just a quick footnote to what Nobu just said. With regard to Japanese corporate distaste for U.S. political reactions to the Thai coup and the sanctions that U.S. law required the U.S. government to impose. The Japanese corporations weren't the only ones uncomfortable with that. The U.S. military and the U.S. State Department were uncomfortable with it. In other words, these were basically required reactions, sanctions and so on, in U.S. law imposed by Congress. And the Pentagon was very unhappy with having to basically sanction a security partner that they highly valued. So there was and there was a fair amount of slow rolling and foot dragging and so on that occurred as a consequence of that. Larry?
Yeah, so thanks, and thanks for the introduction. I think distinguished means old, but anyway, I'll take it still.
I'll plead guilty.
I'm still around, so that's good. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the potential for collaboration between U.S. and Japanese kind of corporate interests vis-a-vis competition with both economic competition and business competition, as well as competition for influence with China in Southeast Asia. And we'll focus on three areas, all three of which were covered in the G20 communique, and are kind of part of the Japan agenda for G20, or were part of the agenda for this year. But before going into it, those three areas, I think it's important to keep in perspective in looking at U.S., Japan, and China in Southeast Asia, that the U.S. and Japan are still economically, in terms of business presence, much more dominant than China is. So if you look at FDI in the region, U.S. has about 300 billion, Japan has about 260 billion, China barely 60 billion. So a huge difference. Now, of course, that's because China got a later start and they're making up for it. Obviously, it's increasing in terms of flow, but in terms of presence, clearly U.S. and Japan have much larger presence in Southeast Asia than China does. In terms of infrastructure flows, again, we get kind of panicky about BRI and this huge amount of capital that's flowing out of Beijing. But in fact, the 4 of the 5 largest infrastructure financing banks in the world last year were Japanese. The fifth one was Chinese, the China Development Bank. But 4 of the 5 largest are Japanese. The Japanese actually have more infrastructure financing globally than China does. They have more private sector financing as well as more public sector financing in terms of infrastructure. And there's really been interesting work done by an economist in the San Francisco Fed on that topic, which you can find online. The 3 areas I wanted to focus on are trade, digital economy, and infrastructure financing. So on the trade side, we heard from the panel earlier this morning about, of course, the CPTPP and the importance the important role that Japan played. And I think, in looking at those 3 issues, by the way, I think I want to say from the very top that it's really interesting that Japan is playing a leadership role in 2 out of those 3 issues. And the U.S. is clearly playing a junior partnership role in those areas. And I don't mean to be critical of the United States by saying that. I think it's actually a healthy development that we're seeing Japan playing a leadership role really kind of for the first time. And the U.S. has been, frankly, urging that leadership role for many decades now. And we're actually now seeing it. And Prime Minister Abe is obviously one of the driving forces behind that change. In the trade side, well, this will be a criticism, because in the trade side, obviously there was a vacuum left by the U.S. by withdrawing from TPP, but Japan and Australia, took up that issue, drove forward the TPP-11. It was successfully ratified, and now is in force. And that's been, again, I give Japan a lot of credit for doing that and keeping the international economic order going. The impact, however, on Southeast Asia, at least for now, is going to be pretty minimal. It's really limited to one country, which is Vietnam. So Vietnam is the only country in Southeast Asia that has actually, besides Singapore, and Singapore is a different beast, is the only other country that has ratified the CPTPP. So Malaysia and Brunei, the other 2 Southeast Asian countries that are members of TPP-11, but they have not ratified, and frankly, the prospects for ratification in the next several years are problematic, and I'm doubting that. In particular, I think Malaysia is kind of stuck on this. So the good news is that Vietnam has got a clear road ahead, and so they are already receiving more Japanese investment from already a high base. Thailand is the #1 destination for Japanese investment in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, I think, is by #2. Isao-san probably knows better than I. But it's getting a lot more of that investment because of the TPP-11, which was additional to the market access that Vietnam got out of the EPA, the bilateral EPA, which was a number of years ago they concluded. So TPP-11 got them additional access in Japan. They also had, Scott mentioned earlier, investment protections that Japan did not get in the EPA. So it's been a great boon for Vietnam. It will continue to be a boon. In terms of, I think, in terms of further collaboration, I think it might. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The real trade issue now in Southeast Asia is not so much this TPP-11. It's the changing and the transformation of supply chain. That's basically coming out of the U.S.-China trade war. And we're seeing already major changes. Ironically, actually, it's the Chinese companies who are moving first from China into Southeast Asia. So that's the major development we're seeing right now. Foreign companies, particularly American companies, are not moving quite as rapidly, partly for a number of reasons we can go into later if people are interested in that. But eventually they will, of course, particularly if the trade war and the trade conflict continues. And so who the beneficiaries are going to be in Southeast Asia for that is obviously going to be those countries that have the most open environment and the investment protection rules, frankly, like Vietnam is doing now because of TPP-11. So I mean, one of the things that U.S. and Japanese companies could do and probably should do is urge and continue to urge, I know they already are, countries like Malaysia to ratify and try to get over their political issues. And of course, countries like Philippines and Thailand to join. And Philippines and Thailand, of course, have already expressed interest in joining. Moving quickly to the digital economy story. So Japan, I thought, did a good job of getting approval in G20, which is a difficult environment to do this, on some basic principles for digital trade. And here, my main interest is in data governance and internet governance. Now, clearly, we have a clear set of issue of competition between China and kind of the rest of the world on this. I mean, you could also look at it as divided between three. So you have the US-Japan approach to these two things. You have the European approach, which is on internet governance is similar, but not on data governance. And then China, which is a very different, has a very different approach to data and internet governance. So there is definitely a competition, and that competition is very much underway in Southeast Asia now. So we're kind of fighting for the heart and soul, essentially, of Southeast Asia when it comes to digital economy and data and internet governance issues. And so I think it was a good thing that Japan was able at least to move us forward slightly. Of course, China is a member of G20, so they couldn't move it forward that much. But it does raise issues about, again, how U.S. and Japanese companies can talk about the benefits that countries in Southeast Asia get from an open, basically open governance, uncensored and free internet, and then data movement, and particularly the ability to access data through the cloud. And one of the main arguments is going to be very similar to the trade debates that we had back in the 1980s in Southeast Asia, which is that it's very hard for small economies to prosper in a world of AI, IoT, and biotech if they can't get access through the cloud to very large data sets. Because the national data sets aren't going to do it, because these countries are too small for that. So localizing data, restricting access both inside and out to data is going to be problematic for these countries. China, some folks would say, is big enough that they don't have to worry about that. I disagree with that. Because their data set is large, 1.4 billion people, it's a lot of people, but they're all Chinese. and AI doesn't, you need diversity to make AI work. I mean, obviously, face recognition technology, if you only have white guys, we see this in the States already, you have major problems. It doesn't work. So I think over time, I'm hoping that Southeast Asia will be, the countries will see that the benefits of openness are going to be greater than the benefits of kind of protectionism in this area. And again, U.S. and Japan, Japanese companies can be open about this. Last thing, I'll just touch on it really very quickly. Infrastructure financing. We talked this morning about quality infrastructure. The principles in the G20 communique, they're great. That's really important. The other area that I would just point to is the importance of getting institutional investors, like the former employee. The employer, Scott Siemens and myself, MetLife, get the institutional investors doing more infrastructure investment, because that is what's going to fill the infrastructure investment gap that exists globally. $80 trillion, 2/3 of which happen to be in U.S. and Japan, are at play here, and obviously outdistancing anything that any kind of financing that China could bring to infrastructure financing. So just 4% of that. Of institutional investments under management, if that's deployed in infrastructure, the infrastructure gap problem's gone. But the problem is, we talked about it for 15 years now. We haven't been able to get the institutional investors involved. How can we do that? U.S. and Japan can play a leadership role in that area. Thanks.
Thanks. So I am going to focus primarily on that infrastructure issue and looking specifically at the energy sector, just because that is, for Southeast Asia in particular, such a major portion of that infrastructure need. So I think many of us in the room are probably familiar with the Asian Development Bank prediction that $26 trillion of investment is needed for infrastructure around developing Asia. About 14 trillion of that is in the Indo-Pacific region, South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And about half of that is specifically for the power sector. It is not a coincidence that China's Belt and Road Initiative is therefore focusing many of its investments abroad, particularly in the power sector, as well as in the transportation infrastructure sector. So looking at the initiatives coming out under the economic pillar of free and open Indo-Pacific here in the United States, as well as new initiatives from Japan like the Partnership for High Quality Infrastructure, it's no surprise that energy infrastructure in particular is a focus area under both individual initiatives as well as those that have been announced jointly. So I'm going to focus sort of on this framework of government initiatives, not to avoid the corporate side of things, but because I think that is providing a framework for support for corporate engagement from both the United States and Japan in Southeast Asia. As we know, both are already deeply involved, but the United States in particular has not been as directly involved in heavy physical infrastructure as Japan has in recent years. And so this partnership will be key moving forward as the US seeks to engage on infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia specifically. And I think it is really relevant to note that within this infrastructure gap that we talk about, there is such a significant gap that there's space for all of the countries, United States, Japan, and China, to be engaged. And so as we start to look at what each of these countries and the companies from these countries are doing, the question is not so much one of only competition, but also one of the standards that are being set. I think many of us have seen reporting and concerns about the debt sustainability and environmental and social safeguard questions surrounding a lot of Chinese projects in the region. There's space for Chinese projects in the region alongside US and Japanese projects, but I think the question is, how can we find ways as other development partners and as the private sector to improve the standards that are being used for projects around the region? And so that engagement on safeguards is something that's been very explicitly built into both US and Japan initiatives under Free and Open Indo-Pacific. So at the risk of reviewing things that people are already familiar with, I do think it's really relevant to look at some of the big changes coming out of the United States through the BUILD Act, through Asia Edge and the other economic engagements under the Indo-Pacific, specifically because while government initiatives, they will set a framework for further engagement in the infrastructure sector from US companies. So when we look at regional investment, one of the main reasons that 2/3 of investment that Larry just mentioned has not flown into the infrastructure sector in the region is one of risk. It's one of access and it's one of risk. So a lot of these new changes are ultimately intended to improve the regulatory regime for the region and to provide options to de-risk projects. So when you look at some of the changes that the BUILD Act will bring to OPEC or the new DFC, as it will be turned into very shortly, they look at things like allowing for the provision of loans in local currency, allowing for capacity building support and grant making much earlier on in the project process than traditional development finance has provided. And this will really allow for engagement early on, particularly in developing countries where regulatory frameworks are often outdated or simply insufficient, to provide regulatory clarity and policy clarity on projects that will then attract investment from the West. So in addition to the expansion of capacity of OPEC, these other changes are all changes that will potentially make financing easier to access for American corporations and consortium partners from other countries like Japan that are interested in investing in this region. And within that, I think there's also sort of this sense of a transition to the Indo-Pacific region, which previously has not received as significant a portion of funds from OPEC as might have been expected. So looking to the future, these changes will likely make it easier for companies that are interested in investing in Southeast Asia and other areas around the Indo-Pacific to gain access and support from U.S. government agencies and development finance institutions. And it will also just open the door to financing that they might not have had access to otherwise. Moving beyond the BUILD Act, which has gotten a lot of attention here, I do think it's worth exploring also some of the more specific initiatives under Indo-Pacific, particularly Asia Edge, because that has really laid out a framework for collaboration with Japan through the institution of the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, and much more recently, the Japan-U.S. Mekong Power Partnership, both of which are really supporting developments in Southeast Asia. So Asia Edge, as we all know, is sort of the focus on energy and access and growth throughout the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia in particular, which sits sort of geographically at the heart, as well as at the heart of future energy demand, since Southeast Asia is driving about 60% of the projected energy demand growth through 2030. And key priorities under Asia Edge include access and reliability of the energy and electricity supply, energy governance questions of open, fair, transparent energy trade, particularly for the LNG market, which I think, as we all know, is a particular area of interest for the US, and also for Japan, given not only Japan's interest in importing LNG, but the role that Japanese companies play in purchasing a significant portion of that US LNG and bringing that to Japan and other Asian markets. So that is a key focus. Both of these things have been sort of explicitly written in to the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, the development of LNG markets in third countries, and the development of infrastructure to support energy trade and electricity trade and access in third countries are both priority areas. And this is perhaps most clearly reflected in the announcement that Secretary Pompeo made in the last couple of months over the summer in Bangkok about the Japan-U.S. Mekong Power Partnership, which looks specifically as a bilateral U.S.-Japan engagement on energy infrastructure in the region to support energy trade and electricity transmission lines within sort of the ASEAN power grid context and within the context of power sector imbalances between the Mekong countries themselves. Looking at the business opportunities, obviously there's sort of the policy side, capacity building and regulatory aspect of this engagement under JUMP and under GSIP, but there is also the clear down the road option for Japanese and US companies, many of which are already interested in the region, some of which already have MOUs for projects in the Mekong countries, to then receive additional support through OPEC, through JBEC, through other financial institutions that are playing a role in these strategies, and also potentially improve complementarity between those projects, because through my own work in Southeast Asia, I've had many conversations with American companies that are interested in power generation. I've had conversations with Japanese companies that are interested in electricity transmission. To my knowledge, most of those groups are not talking to one another. They're not necessarily aware of one another's business interests or the real complementarity. That's where this government framework for JUMP and other coordination on energy issues in the region could potentially provide opportunities for these companies, because some of those projects likely would not go forward. For instance, the power generation projects might be very difficult to finance if you don't also have an economic argument for those transmission lines. Within this broader framework, I think there's a lot of opportunity for complementarity. Hopefully some of these projects may be consortium projects. My impression to date is that given the long history of Japan in infrastructure investment in the region and the more recent withdrawal and now return of American companies in this physical infrastructure sector, is that the consortium partnerships may not quite be ready to go yet. There is a trust building element of engagement that needs to happen, because while there's clearly political will from the governments, and I think there's high level interest from corporations in the United States and Japan in working together, they don't necessarily have those corporate partnerships ready to go off the bat for projects in Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of reasons for that, particularly simply that withdrawal on the US side has meant that Japanese companies mainly had consortiums with other Japanese companies or with local partners in the region. And so there needs to be relationships built and clear understanding of what role US and Japan can play in direct consortium partnerships. But that complementary investment and coordination is something that I think is much more likely and feasible in the immediate term and fits squarely within the government policies for unlocking private sector investment in the region. So I'm going to end there and go ahead and turn it over.
Right.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's terrific to be here with such a great panel. Stepping back a bit, there are really three topics here, right? There's the United States, there's Japan, and Southeast Asia. And to cooperation, obviously, there's at least two entities here, the United States and Japan, at play. And as a civil servant, I think it's important that I have a note from my sponsor. USAID's Administrator Mark Green has stated, and I'll quote, "By promoting open, transparent, rules-based, and citizen-responsive governments in Asia, the Indo-Pacific strategy mitigates the influence of predatory countries while unlocking private sector-led growth that help drive sustainable development and increase partner countries' self-reliance." Now, what you may not know is I'm brand new to USAID. I've been on the job 5 weeks. But I think going back to Administrator Green's comment, he and this administration have been trying to pursue a sort of different approach to development. And I guess I've sort of bought onto it by extension, by joining. I came from the US Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration, where I worked with our good friend here. And then later, the US Small Business Administration's Office of International Trade. In fact, I was involved in every round of the modernization of NAFTA, including multiple chapters. And that other agreement that was mentioned earlier that Japan has been taking quite a leadership role in, 5 years of my life went towards that. And I think sometimes we need to remember, what does that agreement entail? There was a lot of authorship here in Washington in that regard. Also, a lot of my work has been in Southeast Asia and with the BRICS, doing a variety of work on really taking forward the business, from Commerce and SBA, the business priorities of predictability, trying to make the business environment friendly for foreign direct investment. And I think the figures that were mentioned earlier were very key. If we pull out just a little bit further from ASEAN, let's look at Taiwan. We've held roundtables with Taiwan on transparency and good governance from 2014 to 16. And they took very good cues and then on their own developed their own transparency decree that went into effect without much public notice that went into effect October 2016 that allows for, in some ways, more transparency in the regulatory development process than we have here in Washington and here in the United States. As a result, Taiwan has increased its position in WEF's Global Competitiveness Report by at least 2 positions during that time. So they have made themselves, this talk about improving self-reliance, Taiwan has done just that. And this is the kind of model, I think, of cooperation. Obviously, Japan and the United States have a very long history of cooperating with Taiwan. And I think that lends itself to our discussions today. Soon after this, I have to run to the airport because as a new employee of the Trade and Regulatory Reform Office at USAID, we're working with the ASEANs all next week on improving implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is probably one of the most landmark agreements the WTO has inked, in a decade or so. And it's very exciting to see the Southeast Asian countries really come to it with a lot of interest and realize the economic benefits therein. Going forward, I think it's interesting with, and hopeful, with the new US-Japan bilateral deal. Granted, it's only on agriculture and digital trade and a little bit of market access. I think it's hopeful that a broader agreement will be inked in the coming months, and that once that sort of shared mutual understanding, and this is, I think, unfortunately, some of this cooperation might be hostage to just inking that agreement, that wider US-Japan agreement, that once that's in place, it's a lot easier to pursue joint work in Southeast Asia. Obviously, the TPP is out there. Vietnam, Malaysia, while some are implementing the agreement, it's still there, and everybody knows it's there. All those countries know that what sort of the regional standard is. The USMCA is another standard in that same regard, that's sort of the blueprint to going forward. But once the US-Japan agreement's nailed down, I think, in the coming months, it's just a whole lot easier to conceive of ways that we can really advance foreign direct investment and trade within the ASEAN region, and then, of course, beyond. And I'll leave my remarks there. I'll keep them fairly short.
Thank you all. I think you'll agree with me. We've maintained the standard. I'll try and throw out just a couple of questions to sort of get things rolling, and then I hope and trust that the audience will carry the ball from there. I wanted to just key on a point that was made right at the end of the last panel from the audience, and that was the absence of discussion on climate. So it's a little bit left field, but not very much. Capital of Indonesia is gradually being inundated. These issues are real. I recall a conversation some years ago with a senior scientist at NOAA who commented in conversation that sea level rise is not uniform around the world because of tides and winds, is that there are actually a lot of differentials. And the largest impact of sea level rise, actual measurable rise, is in right where we're talking about, Southeast Asia, the western rim of the Pacific. So our focus here is on corporate Japanese and US interest in the Southeast Asia. Do you see, is this something that's still too speculative for the corporate world to take hold of? Or do you see some folks in the corporate world beginning to say, there's something really big going on here, and there's going to be a whole lot of money being spent to deal with it, and we ought to become part of that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So yes, you correctly have addressed one of the most important thing. You mentioned about predictability, and one of the unpredictability is the climate change, not only about the political economic situation. And there's a strong appetite, definitely, from the Japanese corporate too. And one of the key field is urban planning. Like as you said about the Jakarta, sinking down. There are a lot of engineerings that thinks that they have the edge in mitigating all these risks that is going to come forward. Especially if you look at the landscapes and the environmental conditions that what Japan has and what Jakarta has. Like just compare Tokyo and Jakarta. There's a lot of common challenges. You name it, the flood, you name it, in every aspect. And
Earthquakes.
Earthquakes. Typhoon is not in Indonesia, but those kind of development technologies and standards are now very much into the discussion. Not just how to build the urban that is currently urban, but also the new urban, which is, for example, industrial parks. Like, what are the standards, like the security standards, to face the risk of flooding, to face the risk of landslidings and everything. So that kind of talks of common governance standards are already there. And also, a lot of corporates are already going ahead of its own. Like one of the companies are like Aeon, those kind of new type of shopping center construction, standards. Like in Cambodia, where there was no architectural standards to set those kind of environmental standards. They set the sample, they set the standards how these buildings should be. How to wire the electricity wires in terms of this risk and that risk. So I think those corporates are trying to set a standard on its own by all these kind of buildings and earthquake-proof type of standards to show that this is the way to go for Southeast Asian urban development, which is a long kind of trend that will inevitably be there in the coming decades.
Clearly this is an infrastructure-related issue, right? Both in terms of reducing reliance on fossil fuels and reducing emissions in terms of investment in new power generation, as well as infrastructure for mitigating and adjusting to what is going to be inevitable climate change impact, because we're clearly not going to meet the targets, and therefore we're going to continue to have to find ways of dealing with it, adjusting, and helping countries do that. And so I would just say, on the first one, it's always a difficult issue, because the balance that and I face this all the time when I was at the Asian Development Bank, the balance between looking at the interests of citizens who don't have power at all, and how you get them power quickly and cheaply, is against emissions is a big one, because coal is cheap, and coal-powered, particularly back then. Fortunately, that balance is a little better now, but still, fossil fuels are still economically competitive, more competitive than wind and solar. And so you're basically having to make that balance, and these countries have to make that balance as well. I had endless arguments with Indonesian Deputy Prime Minister on bringing down all these coal plants that were being dismantled in China because they were spewing out too much too much pollution and emissions, and bring it and setting them up really cheaply in Indonesia to provide so that he can meet his power plan targets. A very legitimate goal, because people were suffering. When you don't have power, you take extreme measures, and so you have that problem, and that's going to continue to be an issue. And I think obviously whatever we can do to bring down the cost of wind and solar, and particularly for developing emerging markets, is important. One thing I would just add, though, in terms of corporate interests, I think looking at American and Japanese institutional investors, particularly pension funds, because they tend to be public, is that they now have, particularly in the States, have an ESG, environmental sustainability and governance angle now that they are required to look at. And so when you're talking about getting institutional investors involved more in infrastructure projects, actually there's a direct line, because a lot of these institutional investors are required now to have that as one of the factors they look at when they make their investments.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth flagging as well for Southeast Asia. As Marvin mentioned, it is one of the areas in the world that is most vulnerable to climate change. And it is also an area where you are seeing those impacts already felt by local communities and policymakers. And I think this year's record drought in mainland Southeast Asia is a perfect example of this, where electricity production from hydropower dropped so significantly that you had rotating blackouts in Cambodia and in Myanmar because the traditional monsoon was so disrupted. It was 2 months late. It impacted food security this year. You saw a drop in fish cast. It impacted electricity production. It impacted water availability. So I think these issues are increasingly and rapidly growing as an issue on the minds of local policymakers. So I think you're starting to see a pull because of that, because of this attention that local communities and policymakers must give to the impacts of climate change and the risks of climate change, as well as a response from interested corporate parties on issues ranging from alternative energy to energy efficiency, or even to their own internal sustainability guidelines. Because I think, for instance, if you look in Cambodia and Vietnam, one of the reasons you're seeing this increasing interest in solar energy is due to the requests from companies that want to make sure that they're able to meet their own sustainable energy guidelines, for instance, for their manufacturing plants or their data centers. So you see it both as a business opportunity and as an internal shift in reputation reasons that is sort of driving this shift.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because one of the things that is often forgotten about is that climate change is a fairly new issue, and it requires an innovative approach. And if you don't have a regulatory system that allows for innovation, then you're going to be trapped by big changes. And when I think of big changes that affect archipelagos, I think of those monster storms we've been experiencing. And I think what's interesting, I just came back in June from an APEC meeting in Taiwan, in Taipei, I should say. And I introduced our colleagues there to the port of San Diego. I had recently visited the port as a sort of model of a regulatory sandbox. A sandbox is the idea that typically regulators just regulate. But in certain situations, they can also be an incubator. And the port of San Diego is one of those. They, of course, regulate the shipping that comes in and out of the port. But in addition, they have a blue tech incubator there. And one of the key technologies that's being developed there, and that the USG is showcasing actually next week in Taiwan, is eco-cement. Regular cement you will see all across Japan in the waters, sort of protecting the coast. But cement itself corrodes and is not terribly good for the ocean environment. This eco-cement that has been developed there in the port does not have those negative impacts on the ocean, but it also does something really cool. It attracts coral. It attracts other sea life. And basically, the natural environment helps buttress the man-made structure. And when I think of the challenges that the Philippines or the Indonesia with monster storms, and how fragile the populations along the coast are, as we've seen also in Japan recently, having that innovative regulatory system that allows for these kinds of technologies so that you don't regulate brand new ideas out of the market, right, is absolutely fundamental to an SME ecosystem. And I think that is one of the things that we did at SBA. We held a brand new kind of training for the ASEANs about 2 years ago on SME ecosystem, where we put together the whole piece of the regulatory, the financial piece, and advising small businesses on how to innovate, and having that sort of overarching government support and the ability to innovate in a regulatory environment, which is usually a contradiction, right? But I think the port is really interesting. And as I've already met with the port, we hope to, after our little pilot program in Taiwan, to actually bring them out to other parts of Southeast Asia. I'm obviously thinking of places like the Philippines as one of the top places to consider bringing such ideas. But I think it's the regulatory environment, maybe the software as opposed to the hardware, that allows the hardware to be developed, right? Is that sort of non-seen element of the regulatory environment that allows for innovation. I think that's fundamental to challenging these problems like climate change and population and other issues.
That's great. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I'm presuming something here. I want to try one more question because I can't resist it before turning over to the audience. But it's a bit of a segue. Environmental impacts, you mentioned storms. Just within my fairly recent memory, we had a super typhoon roar across central Philippines, massive devastation. We had another environmental related issue, the tsunami that hit and basically destroyed northern Sumatra. We had an earlier super typhoon that hit the coast of Burma, swept up the Irrawaddy. And in each of those cases, you have, for the United States, Pacific Command has substantial resources to go in and try to mitigate the effects of environmental disasters of that kind. That was done in the case of the Philippines. There was some assistance to Japan in the case of the nuclear disaster. It was offered to Burma, and there was a very tense sort of confrontation between Pacific Command and the Burmese generals as to whether or not they would accept help from a country they did not trust on the part of the Burmese, the United States. The answer ultimately was no. Anyway, at least to a long segue to just a question. U.S. and Japan have a very active corporate presence in Southeast Asia. Many already noted Japan in many ways is in the lead of that. But on the security side, the U.S. has been a major player, remains so. Japan, under the Abe administration, is increasingly focused on security issues in Southeast Asia, looking for security partners. What does that mean for the corporate sector? As you're sitting, whether you're Japanese or American, and you're looking at a growing U.S.-Japanese security collaboration at the governmental defense level, does that have significant spillover into the corporate world in terms of collaboration, projects, ideas, or is it basically cocooned off as a separate entity?
I can just, it's not disaster related, but one kind of data point, but it's still very much a work in progress, is that in 2000, what was it, 12 or 13, 14, the Japan got rid of its ban on export of weapons, and so now it can export weapons. And obviously, one of the ways that the U.S. has developed our military relationships around the world is through our foreign military sales program, and having very close relationships, obviously, with foreign militaries in that area. One area of potential collaboration, but this is still very much a issue of potential, because right now Japan is still working through its own internal issues on how to kind of take advantage of this policy move to open up export of weapons, is to work together to forge closer mill-mill relationships in Southeast Asia. I mean, Japan's already doing that unilaterally by itself in terms of, mainly Coast Guard kind of patrol ships and things of that sort. but is still is not very active in the foreign military sales area. We obviously have a lot of experience. I know the DoD would very much want to work closely with the Japanese government on this issue. So that's one area of potential. And again, obviously, the U.S. And Japanese private sectors are very interested in that. Right now, the constraint is getting the two governments to work together.
Can I?
Yeah, go
Yes. I can't really answer directly to your question but the one thing you highlight is right. It's the kind of disaster relief operations that brings the military that Japanese force will find itself in Southeast Asia. Like the clear example was in Philippines when all the super typhoon went. It was really a very quick deployment of Japanese military and both the fire department as well.
Also
So-
true in Indonesia, in
Also true.
Sumatra.
In Sumatra too. And I think the benefit of U.S.-Japan alliance was, like, especially in Sumatra, if you consider who Yudhoyono was at that time, President Yudhoyono was trained in United States. That time, the head of the army chief in Japan was also his classmate in United States. So that IMET network really kind of worked out in Indonesia. Indonesian, Yudhoyono had a huge, opposition voice inside the cabinet and outside of the cabinet too. Why would you trust these people? Right, they are foreign people in an insurgency area like Aceh, the same as the Myanmar case, and that time that trust that was built like decades before with the United States, with the Japanese army, really worked in a disaster moment. So I can't really get to the corporate interest, but obviously, I mean, the kind of military trust that was built around that area in the 80s was really flourishing in the 2000 and 2010s. And I think that's a very strong lesson to be learned in tackling against the new threat, which is the climate change, and which has to work together.
Yeah, so really interesting dynamics at work here. Let me throw it open to the audience and invite, wait for the microphone to wend its way in your direction.
Yeah, wow, another tremendous panel. Son, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess it's more editorial, but there's some question here too, to go back to the climate change thing. At one point, if I was in Japan when I remember the 747 crashed into the mountain between that, and the Japanese army or the Japanese authorities were very hesitant to ask the U.S. to come in and help that time, and I think learn from that disaster. So perhaps there's a iterative process, and Operation Tomodachi actually was much improved. I would just wanted to say that's hopeful that perhaps San Diego can sell the cement to the Chinese when they're building their next island. But back to just the climate issue,
It's called a cynical
not just
comment.
this is unnecessary. It's going to come out political. It's not intended to be political, but we have an administration that's basically denying climate change, and yet we go to places like Kwan Ken, now has incredible smog problems, right? It's not just the water; it's the air, it's the everything. And how do we get to a point where this panel and probably most of the people in the room realizes that the climate is a very important thing? But I'm American, and many of us are here. Our government is not on that ballpark. It's not there.
We're impeaching him.
Sorry.
We're impeaching him.
Well, we need to unelect him. Yes.
That was a comment more than a question.
I was going to say,
so I'm-
that's like a
I'm
rhetorical
gonna-
question to me.
Yeah. Why don't we go over here on this side of the room?
Hi. Mike Corbin, U.S. Department of Commerce. I'm in the Office of Financial Services. And I really liked Larry Greenwood's comment about the importance of institutional investors and the role they can play in a number of issues corporately between Japan and the U.S. in particular. Some of these were identified in the G20 with the longevity issue that was put forward. Japanese are living so long, which is great, but unfortunately they're outliving their annuities. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the two financial sectors, particularly in the insurance and the private pension areas, to link together on developing products and so forth, and that could be something that takes off on a global span. But I just wanted to hear more from Larry, if he could, other corporate avenues for addressing these problems, maybe through financial services and so forth. It could even include climate change as well. I know we have a committee, we lead the committee to the OECD on insurance and private pensions, and ESG is another issue that comes up within there, although it's been definitely controversial. I'd like to hear what you could say on more on the institutional investor issues and things two countries could do together.
I'll be quick because you have a lot more knowledge than I do, I think, on this particular issue. But I think that, for the benefit of the larger group, basically the issue here is that from the institutional investor point of view, life insurers and pension funds, they're desperately looking for 20 to 30-year assets to match against their liabilities. Because unlike banks who borrow money or go on the money market to lend money out, who are taking maturity mismatch, insurance companies and pension funds are taking 20 to 30-year liabilities. That is, they're promising to pay your family when you die, or they're paying your pension in the future when you retire. So they need assets that are going to give you a very predictable cash flow in order to be able to meet those liabilities. So they're looking for exactly the opposite kinds of assets the banks are. Fortunately, infrastructure is exactly that kind of asset. It's a long-term asset. Banks should not be financing infrastructure. Banks finance most infrastructure today in Asia because it's a bank-centric financial system, and that's part of the problem that we're having in Asia. And also, of course, another way of saying that they're bank-centric is that they have underdeveloped capital markets. They're not fully developed bond markets. So how do you get beyond that is the kind of question. And so U.S. and Japan, because, again, they have the bulk of the world assets from institutional investors, because, I mean, in Japan's case, it's the most insured country in the world. I think every Japanese has an average of 3 or 4 life insurance policies, which for American is just unbelievable. So they have all kinds of savings in life insurance, and of course the pension system is the GIF is the largest pension system in the world. And so they have these huge assets. They need to get better returns. They're under incredible pressure to get better returns because of the life insurers sold products 30 years ago for a 7% return, and they're not getting that now, so they're losing money on these policies. So everyone's desperate to look for that, and so the question is, how do you get them in? It's risk, as Courtney has said, but it's also you need to get all the players in the room. And Japan and U.S. I think have the convening power to do that. You have to get obviously the banks, you have to get the insurers, the pension funds, and you have to have a very practical discussion about how do you get this seeded, because it's the chicken and egg problem. There's just not enough bankable projects out there. So obviously project preparation and the kind of stuff that Build Act is going to do is great, and putting a lot more money. I mean, we just need a whole lot more money, even more than the Build Act has, in project preparation, TAs, technical assistance in Asia. That's one of the key constraints. But it's really also very important to get in the room the Indonesian development financial officials, the Thai development financial officials. It's really got to come, because that's where you start. Because one of the things I worry about with some of these initiatives is that all of us from the West are talking about how we're going to do all these great things for infrastructure projects in developing countries in Southeast Asia. We're kind of leaving them out of the conversation, and they have to be at the center of the conversation. And they're the ones who have to identify which projects have the priorities. They're the ones we need to start with. There's a lot of sensitivity in Southeast Asia about us coming in. I mean, the regulatory reform stuff is going to be a challenge. Let's face it, right? Because we've been down this track before, and telling them what to do so they can get our money, and they hate that. They really hate us telling them what to do in order to get our money. And so we're just going to have to figure out how to get that conversation started in a very, very constructive manner. Let me just stop there.
Okay. Front? Wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Are there projects in Southeast Asia, infrastructure projects, where different countries are cooperating and things are going well? we've kind of talked about all the hurdles to cooperating and making things go smoothly. Are there examples of success? And if so, why? Are there certain factors that are in play that make it more successful?
This goes to your point, Courtney, about not having consortiums kind of up and ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think offhand, I think it's difficult to point to a specific U.S.-Japan collaborative infrastructure project, mainly because it's so early in that pipeline that there's not much happening yet. I mean, I guess the closest is probably the Papua New Guinea electrification project, which is U.S., Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Still fairly early, but is looking to support electrification, access, power generation, transmission lines, all of the things we talked about before. And I think that's kind of being treated as a trial. It's I think about a year into the project. There's been some slow but steady movement, and you've had the opportunity for U.S. investors and U.S. government agencies that are providing sort of the framework to work through some of those bureaucratic hurdles. I mean, I think there are, of course, many instances of Japanese infrastructure investments where they have local partners on the ground in Southeast Asia and have been able to successfully move forward. And I think you could say the same for most of the other development partners, but in this sort of truly coordinated manner, I don't know of an offhand far along that pipeline progression project yet.
I would just get, Brian, in your SBA world, did you ever run into something that's relevant to the question?
Actually, I want to get back to Larry's comment
Okay.
a little bit. That sort of gets at Mr. Siemens' views as well. Is that nobody likes to be told what to do. We've had success at SBA and at Commerce in sort of explaining some of the economics behind FDI. It's been proven in many independent studies that transparency and good governance has a positive relationship with FDI. Not only is it a positive relationship, that's the more transparency, the better governance system, the more investment, but it's a strong relationship. So it goes right across the chart. There's also another aspect, is that it's relational. So let's take it out of Southeast Asia. If you are thinking of putting a factory in South America and you have the choice of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, where's the least risk going to be? Well, it's Chile, right? That's a much more transparent governance environment. And when we have these discussions with government officials, we bring in the private sector, and they tend to agree with us and with the economics. And they're like, yeah, we want more investment. And they realize it's about self-help. And going back to our administrators' interest in self-reliance, self-help is rather key, and the ASEANs get it. They get it. I think bringing that reality that unless you're a BRIC, you have one way to compete for investment, and that is an open, transparent governance system, right? BRICS can get away with it because their economy is so large that a foreign investor will invest because the gains they're potentially so large. But when you're a small and medium-sized economy like most of ASEAN, right, you have one thing to control your government, right? You can't control the oil price, you can't control the rice price or the wheat price, but the one thing governments can do is control themselves. And if they focus on that as a form of self-help, they don't have to go begging to the World Economic Forum for investment. The investors will come. And so on their own, they'll be knocking on the door. That's what I think AID hired me to do, is to take that message more broadly to the developing world. And I think the relationship between it and the Indo-Pacific strategy are easily understood. But I hope that helps.
I've got one follow-up question.
Okay, real quick. This will be, no, that's fine. We have time for one follow-up. That's it.
I know that South Korea is also really ramping up their Mekong activities with ASEAN. Is there overlap with what the U.S. and Japan are doing there, or is it Are they compatible? What's the outlook?
So South Korea is very much ramping up both investment in the region and engagement through their own Mekong partnership with the region. I think there's complementarity in that you see, for instance, the Thai ACMEX framework, which is sort of their own answer to a lot of these external partnerships that are brought to the region that links together the Irrawaddy, the Chao Phraya, the Mekong into this economic corridor. And you see a lot of development partners, including US, Japan, and I also believe Korea, among others, sort of buying in and saying this is a framework that is locally led that we are interested in engaging with. So you do see similar approaches in that sense. I have not seen the level of coordination between Korea and the US. It's not the same level as like US, Japan. I mean, we've got very concrete initiatives that have been announced between the US and Japan. We've had a lot of discussions with Australia and some MOUs. We've had, I think, discussions with Korea as well, but I think the US-Japan partnership is by far the most advanced in terms of concrete collaboration.
On that positive note, I'm looking at the clock. We've run out of time, so please join me in thanking the panel for what I think is really excellent.
Well done.
And thank you, all of you,
Nice to meet
for
you.
coming. And we now have your reward is lunch.
I did, yeah.